All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you again for being here for our Morning Byte of Cyber webinar series. Today, we're featuring Trent Hine of Rule4, a Colorado-based company, to talk to us about web application security. Before I pass it off to Trent, just want to have a few Zoom reminders for everybody. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to drop them in the chat at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will do our best to get those answered as soon as possible during the presentation. I will have some time at the end for Q&A as well. Additionally, this webinar will be recorded, and we'll be sending the link of the recording back out to everybody who registered following the presentation. You can also find our previous Morning Byte of Cyber webinars on our National Cybersecurity Center YouTube page as well. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to our guest today, Trent. Trent, take it over.
Thanks, Jonah, and good morning, everyone. Super excited to be here today. Can you see my slides okay?
All good.
Excellent. Well, this talk really started with a discussion I was having with Jill Frazier at Jeffco, and oftentimes we do application security pen testing to determine what vulnerabilities might exist in an externally exposed application, and a lot of the times we see kind of the same themes. And the thought was, gosh, if only we could communicate to everyone in the application development and operations chain, what are those things? Maybe they could close those up prior to the pen test exercise, and then we might get better results out of that exercise just because the testers could be focused on more deeper forms of attack and really dive into the application beyond just the superficial layers. And so that was the genesis of this, and I thought it might be good just to spend a few minutes kind of walking through some of the common issues and ways we might protect against them. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Trent. This is my 35th year in cybersecurity and cybersecurity incident response. A lot of folks seem to know me from the Unix and Linux System Administration Handbook. That's now in its 5th edition. We started on that project 32 years ago, and unbelievably, and against my prior claims that we're never doing it again, we are working on a 6th edition of that book that'll be out hopefully next summer. I also do a lot of other security stuff. None of that stuff really is that interesting. But let's start with our topic of the day. I often say that application security is a journey, right? It's not a destination. It's something that we are going to continually work on and continually try to improve. And really, penetration testing is a core task that we need to do anytime we have applications that handle sensitive data, and especially applications that are exposed directly to the internet. And of course, best practice is those be pen tested at least annually. And sometimes people ask me the question like, well, who says I have to pen test it annually? Well, there's a variety of answers to that. If you handle payment card information, credit card data, the PCI DSS standard is very explicit about the need to test it periodically. Other standards are a little less specific on how often, but generally as an industry, we say once a year. But what I often tell people when they ask me that question is like, well, you have your choice. Either you can pen test it or the attackers will do it for you. And of course, it's less expensive in terms of not having to go find and conscript a pen tester to work for you, but it typically is fairly expensive in the outcome if they're able to successfully breach the environment. As I mentioned earlier, all too often pen test findings are pretty predictable. We see some very common themes, and we're going to talk about those in a minute. And it would be great if we could get our app dev teams and our app operations teams on board with the idea that, hey, these are things that matter, and we need to make sure they're addressed within the environment. The more we know about this stuff, I often say the more we know, the more we grow. The more we know about this stuff, the better off we're all going to be. So let's dig in. Many of you may be familiar with the OWASP Top 10. This is the Open Web Application Security Group, and every couple years they publish a new list of what are the top 10 web application security vulnerabilities. And just last year, they released the updated list, and you see the top 10 listed here. I've got them broken out on the next couple slides, so we'll talk through them briefly. But one of the core things that I like to tell folks is this is a great resource to share within your organization, because oftentimes application developers or application operations folks, this may not be their area of expertise. Security may not be their area of expertise. And they're always asking that question, where do I start? Or tell me what I need to do to secure this application. Well, this is really where they should be starting. And let's talk through these top 10 really quick. Well, the number one, and we won't try to dwell too much on these, but the number one vulnerability that we see on the internet today is some type of broken access control. And so this is usually cases where there was an effort to put access control in place. These files are accessible to the public. Here's a different set of files or a different set of data that's supposed to only be accessible to a small subset of the public. But somehow that access control enforcement is not working. And so there's a way or a trick or a vulnerability that allows maybe all users or an attacker to see sensitive data. Cryptographic failures, this is something, if we look back in time, 10 or 20 years, folks sort of laughed or shrugged their shoulders about the need for strong cryptography. But the reality is that there's so much financial gain to be had by attackers that if we don't protect data appropriately, they're going to benefit. And so they'll go to fairly great lengths to get access to sensitive data. That means we need to make sure it is encrypted with an industry standard algorithm, especially through underlying interfaces like APIs. That's another thing that we often encounter, is that the front end web app may in fact be secure, but that web app talks to a lower level service like an API. And the assumption by the team that built it was like, oh, no attacker would ever go look at that lower layer and see if it's secure. And in fact, sometimes it's not. And so we need to make sure that all layers of the apps are secure and use strong cryptography. One of my pet peeves in life is people who talk about scrambling data, that, if we scramble the data, it's secure. And by scramble it, they'll do something like simple letter substitution, replace an A with a B and a B with a C and so on, and call it encrypted. That is not encryption. Encryption is a mathematical process that we need to make sure we apply appropriately. I will talk a little bit about SQL injection and code injection here in a little bit. The ability to get the system to bend to our will by sending it instructions in places where we shouldn't be sending it instructions. Obviously, insecure design, just not thinking about how the application is designed, can result in vulnerabilities. We'll talk about some specifics here in a minute. Security misconfigurations. So this is often at the infrastructure layer. When we talk about web application security, we need to be thinking about the lowest layer, the network layer. We need to be thinking about the infrastructure layer. That might be the server or service or container layer. And then we need to be thinking about the application code itself at a very minimum. It's always fun to talk to executives who give answers like, well, we have a firewall, therefore it's secure. And the reality is nothing could be further from the truth. We really do have to secure all the layers. And I often liken it to, securing a castle, right? It's like, we're going to put our moat around our castle, and then we're going to put some alligators in the moat. And we're probably going to make that moat really big so that we can protect the castle. Vulnerable and outdated components. We've seen a couple of years of this where a variety of commonly known and available vulnerabilities are used months or years later to attack production applications and services on the internet. We, as security practitioners, need to always make sure that we're on top of that and are keeping those up to date, or taking them out of service if we can't update them. Identification authentication failures, that's probably pretty obvious to folks. That's the weak password problem, or not having appropriate controls around user access. Software and data integrity failures. We certainly see the supply chain attacks like SolarWinds and Log4j. and a few others recently. We need to make sure anything we put in the environment is known to be good and is known to be secure. Security logging and monitoring. This is always the redheaded stepchild, or whatever the right term for that is, where folks somehow think that this is not important to pay attention to, but it absolutely is, because it gives us observability and visibility within the environment. And then server-side request forgery, the ability or the vulnerability of letting users provide URLs and URIs to the environment that then are interpreted as if they were authentic. And we need to make sure that we are very aware of that. So if those are our top 10 OWASP vulnerabilities, what are those things that our application developers should be thinking about as they're designing and building and maintaining applications? Well, first and foremost, I would point out the principle of least privilege. Some people call this minimum necessary access, but this is an important secondary control. So absolutely, we should first and foremost have those core external protections in place, encryption and cryptography and access control and so on. But let's just say one of those failed. And it's like the alligators in the moat analogy, is what we want to happen when we have a failure for our primary control is we still want the attacker to be very limited in what they can do. And so principle of least privilege is what helps us with that. The idea here is that we're going to give every user, every service, every account, every privilege, every container, server, whatever you want to put in that blank there, the minimum amount of access it needs to perform its function. And so if for some reason it were to be compromised, the attacker is very limited in what they can access. What's a good example? Well, a great example is where we have a tiered application with a database. I get that it's much easier just to make a service account to access that database that has access to all rows and all tables and everything in unencrypted format. Like, that's super easy to implement. It's also completely insecure, because as soon as that account or layer is somehow compromised, the attacker has all that same access, the entire database. And so I often like to work with application development teams to diagram out what is the minimum necessary access here. Maybe they only need access to one column of one table, or maybe they only need access to an unencrypted field for a few minutes during the life cycle of that application or that process. The more we can narrow that down, the more we can control the outcome in the event of an unfortunate control failure. Configuration management. So this is something that's often forgotten on the operations side. So we might build the application with an amazing secure architecture and implement all of our encryption correctly and so on, and then have it fail in production because our operations team isn't staying on top of configuration management. And so that means any systems that house sensitive data or we move into production, we have documented standards and ways to validate, is that production configuration secured? How we deployed the web server, how we set up file permissions, even the administrators of that system, what passwords or secrets are they using to access it? How do we store this as code? I always like to use the concept of infrastructure as code for production systems, meaning that just like when we develop software, we put it in a software repository and we can see every change that's made. When we're making changes to infrastructure, whether it's Kubernetes containers or bare metal servers, that we have that configuration information captured in a repository. And anytime we want to make a change or update to that, we make the change first in the repository, and hopefully that gets automatically deployed. And then we can see those changes over time. And it also gives us a built-in way to validate that the configuration is what we intended, because we can always compare the configuration in production to the configuration in the repository. Secrets management. This is a funny one, because if you even ask someone on the street, be like, well, we talk about secrets or passwords. How should we store them? How should we protect them? And people would be like, oh yeah, I should protect my password, not share it with others, not post it on a bulletin board or write it on a sticky and put it on my monitor. Even non-security practitioners can usually identify that as a core control around secrets. And then yet, all too often, especially when we're evaluating the security of an application or doing pen testing, is it seems like that somehow got missed. And again, I think it's often due to time constraints or just trying to get things working. Initially, folks will do things like hard code passwords or other credentials in a file or put it in a software repository. And then maybe they forget to take it out or ran out of time. I don't know. But eventually that ends up in production. And I guarantee that that's eventually going to go poorly. We shouldn't ever be putting credentials in code. We shouldn't ever be putting credentials in readable clear text config files. We shouldn't ever be putting credentials in a repository. And that does mean that we might have to adopt some additional layers of how to handle secrets. Like maybe we need some type of secret vaulting system or password vaulting system that the application interacts with to get its credentials. I totally get that that's additional layers of complexity. It is absolutely essential to ensure the security of the environment. And again, this is another one of those things where we see this failing as a secondary control. So yes, we built the application super securely, but there was maybe a configuration error on the server that provided access to files. And then as soon as the attacker got access to those files, they hit a gold mine. Like, here's all of our passwords and secrets right here in a plain text file on that server. That's where pen testing results start to look really interesting, and software developers start to get angry with us for pointing that out. But the reality is it's important to secure all that data. Source safety. We talked a little bit just a couple slides ago about these supply chain attacks, things like Log4j and the attack that happened through SolarWinds, Spring4Shell, and there's a couple others that have happened in the last couple years. Anytime we use code, whether it's code from a commercial vendor, code from Microsoft, or code from some other third-party vendor that we purchased a library or software from, or we download code from the internet. Maybe it's open source software, or a friend. We said we were talking to our coding friend and like, hey, do you have a library already written for this? And they're like, oh, sure, happy to share that with you. Yeah, I'm sure they're happy to share that with us, as is all the open source community, as is our commercial vendors. The reality is that anything we bring or accept into the production environment, we need to vet for security. And the good news is now there are some commercial tools that can help us with that if we have a large repository ecosystem or large code base that we need to evaluate. But somehow, whether we do it manually or we do it with a tool, we need to make sure we can trust the code we're deploying. And not only that, we need to make sure that over time, we're continuously monitoring that. Like, maybe we think it's secure today, but then we find out 3 months later that in fact that vendor or that repository that we got it from was in fact hacked and that contains malicious code. We take on that burden. And oftentimes I tell folks it's like adopting a puppy. I love dogs, and it always really hurts my heart when people are excited to adopt a puppy and they're so cute and small and fun. And then you find that dog chained to a tree in the backyard, all alone 6 years later. We wouldn't want to do that to a puppy or a dog, and we can't do that to any application. If we write a custom application or we bring in an off-the-shelf application, for the life of that application, we have an obligation to secure it, an obligation to manage its code supply chain, and that requires investment. And I think one of the things we need to communicate to our management chains is that there are operational dollars, ongoing operational cost associated with securing the application long-term. Just because it was secure at launch doesn't mean it's secure today. Authentication and authorization, of course, this is the easy one, relatively on these. And the thing that we say today is that anything that's exposed to the internet must have more than one factor of authentication. These days, we're actually pretty picky about what additional factors are acceptable. I will point out right away that non-acceptable additional factors include IP address and more and more so, depending on what type of data you handle, SMS messages. Unfortunately, it is fairly easy these days to spoof both IP address as well as SMS messages. And so I think it's important to ponder, what are we using? Use a real smartphone app, or maybe we have some type of biometric token that we can use as an additional factor to identify the user. But if the app contains any sensitive data, especially if it's exposed to the internet, we've got to have an additional factor. And of course, if we are using password as a type of factor, let's make sure that it is reasonably complex and secure. I will note the most recent Nist guidance about password expirations timeline. Of course, various standards might require a specific timeline, like we can only use a password for 90 days, but the current Nist guidance is we really need to look at user behavior around that. And it would be better if our users were using long, complex, strong passwords and using them appropriately and storing them appropriately than just forcing them to change them often. We get a better benefit out of the user behavior using a complex password. Session management, this is kind of the hidden layer of convenience in web applications. Is often we use a cookie to identify the user's session going forward. When we do that, we need to make sure we're handling cookies appropriately. And I do think it's important to be aware of that as a developer and as an operations team, is take a few moments to look at what cookies are being used by the application, how they're being stored by the user's browser, and what information they contain. And that's going to help inform whether that's appropriate and how we can better secure that. Likewise, we do need to be careful about cross-site request forgery, making sure that whatever cookies and tokens that we're sharing with the user cannot be used across other sites to cause issues, especially around authentication. Data validation is a favorite and something we often see in pen tests. One of the simple examples is, can I, in a field that asks for a username or asks for a password, can I put anything I want there, including things like SQL code, and get that all the way to something that's going to interpret it as code. So if instead of the name, I put in some SQL command that says drop all tables, and that actually gets passed all the way to the SQL database, sure enough, it could potentially impact the integrity or viability of that database. And so every field, every input we accept from the user has to be validated on the server side to ensure that that's what we were expecting back. Oftentimes, it's easier to code that in the browser, in JavaScript in the browser, to check, hey, is that a valid name, or is that a valid birth date, or whatever. But again, if we do that, an attacker can reach under that layer and send the code injection directly to the server. And so client-side validation or browser-side validation isn't acceptable. We need to do that on the server side. And we need to do that beyond just input fields, things like cookies and headers and so on, also important to validate. I know we're running a little short on time here, so I'll try to wrap up on these last couple slides. The final thing I want to point out is logging. I always want to ask developers, how do we know that this application is secure and it's doing what we expect? And a key component of that is logging. And so we should be logging some very specific things. Any successful or unsuccessful authentication attempts, any changes to privileges or new privileges, new users, and then any sensitive security events, things that the application would identify as this is not a normal behavior pattern, this is not normal data access. All of that information should be logged and hopefully go to the organization's security team. If we address just those 8 things that I just walked through, most of our common pen test results are going to drop away. And then we're going to really be able to see in detail what are those hidden things that attackers could use to breach our application or our organization. Thank you guys so much for your time today. I hope a little bit of this was interesting and maybe provide some fodder to share with your app dev and app ops teams. I'll again emphasize what I said at the start, is the application is a journey. None of us are perfect. No application is perfect. But if we can take this knowledge and grow our security, we're going to end up in a better spot. Thanks so much for your time today. You can always reach me through Rule4, rule4.com. I would love to chat with folks more if they have other questions. Thank you, guys. Jonah, do we have any questions we should chat about quick?
Hey, I'm just checking here in the chat. Alyssa, do you see any questions that have popped up in the chat there?
I do not.
Okay, excellent. Well, if anyone doesn't have any questions, we'll leave a last few couple minutes here for you to drop those in. But wanted to give another thank you here to Trent for joining us today. Very grateful that we were able to get this connected, and thanks to Jill as well for prompting that conversation, as you mentioned at the beginning there, Trent. If anyone does have any questions, like Trent said, reach out to him or reach out to us at the NCC, our website, which, Alyssa, if you could put that in the chat there, is colorado-crc.org. We have all of our past Morning Byte of Cyber episodes on our YouTube channel. You can search National Cybersecurity Center. We host 2 of these every month, and we're looking to have more guests as well. We have a couple of exciting upcoming topics on CMMC related things I know coming up, other things we'd love for you to join in for. So if we don't have any other questions here, we will cut it off for today.
Sounds good. Thank you all.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Take care.